Are you serious, Colonel? You called in a civilian, an old man, to fix a 60-ton main battle tank? Lieutenant Michael Westbrook's voice, sharp with the condescending edge of a fresh MIT degree, cut through the damp morning air of Fort Carson's maintenance depot. His words hung like the Colorado fog that blanketed the sprawling facility, wrapping itself around the silent monolithic form of the disabled M1 Abrams tank. Frank McKinnon, 76 years old and clad in simple grease-stained coveralls, didn't so much as flinch. His hands were tucked into his pockets. His body relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on the tank. They were the pale, washed-out blue of a man who had spent a lifetime staring into desert horizons, and they held a stillness that seemed to absorb the young officer's contempt without reflection. He was listening not to Westbrook, but to the silence of the great machine. Colonel James Harrington, the man who had made the call, stood a few paces back, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He knew he was taking a risk. This wasn't just any tank. It was the lead vehicle for a critical readiness exercise starting in less than 48 hours. The digital countdown clock mounted on the depot wall made this abundantly clear: 46:22:07, and ticking down to decisive strike, the largest NATO training operation of the decade. Every second the Abrams sat dead on the concrete was another nail in the coffin of his brigade's reputation. Have you ever watched an old man being treated as if he were invisible? The way his presence is acknowledged with dismissive glances, his experience discarded before he even opens his mouth. Some men might fight against it with loud protestations. Others might shrink away. But there is a third kind of man, the kind who has seen enough of the world to know when to stand his ground in silence. McKinnon was such a man. Westbrook, oblivious to the deeper currents of the situation, pressed his advantage. He was the head of the engineering team, a rising star, with a mind full of schematics and diagnostic flowcharts. He saw the world in binary as a series of problems that could be solved with the right software. This old man was an anomaly, an unquantifiable variable that offended his orderly worldview. "Sir, with all due respect," Westbrook continued, his tone suggesting none was actually due, "my team has been working on this vehicle for 36 straight hours. We've run a full systems check, a level 3 diagnostic on the AGT 1500 turbine engine, and a complete hydraulic pressure analysis." He held up his tablet, its bright screen displaying complex technical readouts. "Every data point we have indicates a catastrophic failure of the main power unit. The computer is unequivocal. It needs a full depot-level replacement." He tapped his tablet for emphasis, as if the glowing screen were an unassailable shield of logic. "That means a flatbed, a crane, and about 3 weeks we don't have." His team of young engineers, all in their early 20s and equally devoted to the digital gospel, shuffled their feet and exchanged smirks. They saw a living fossil, a relic from an analog age, being brought in to bless a dying supercomputer. The absurdity was palpable. Colonel Harrington's gaze shifted between the young officer and the old mechanic. There was history in that look, the kind forged in desert heat and gunfire. He and McKinnon had served together during Desert Storm, though few in this depot would know that. Fewer still would know what McKinnon had done during those frantic days in the Iraqi desert. "Lieutenant Westbrook," Harrington said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a career soldier, "Mr. McKinnon has my complete confidence. Give him whatever he needs." Why would a colonel risk his career on an old man nobody knew? The question seemed to pulse through the air as Harrington turned and walked away, leaving McKinnon alone with Westbrook and his team. McKinnon finally stirred. He began a slow, deliberate walk around the perimeter of the tank. He didn't look at the access panels or the diagnostic ports. Instead, he ran a gnarled hand over the cold-scarred steel of the turret. His touch was gentle, like a man greeting an old wounded friend. The Abrams sat low on its torsion bars, a behemoth of depleted uranium and composite armor, humbled by a ghost in its own machine. $8.5 million of American military hardware rendered impotent by an invisible flaw. Dust from the training fields clung to its flanks, a testament to its recent and final exertions. He stopped near the rear of the tank, near the massive engine grills, and turned his head slightly as if catching a scent on the wind. From his pocket, he pulled a worn silver Zippo lighter. The metal was scratched and dulled from decades of use, but the emblem of the 2nd Armored Regiment remained clear on its face. McKinnon flicked it open and closed with a practiced, rhythmic click, clack, the sound sharp and clear in the tense silence. Westbrook let out a short, incredulous laugh. What are you going to do now? Fix a 60-ton tank with a cigarette lighter. Several of the young engineers joined in the laughter, a chorus of academic superiority. McKinnon ignored them. The sound of the Zippo, the metallic snap, was a key turning a lock in his mind. His voice when it came was quiet and gravelly, a stark contrast to Westbrook's clipped precision. How did she sound before she died? Westbrook blinked, thrown by the simplicity of the question. Sound, the engine output, was nominal until the point of failure. The decibel readings were within standard operational parameters. McKinnon's gaze didn't waver. That's not what I asked. I asked how she sounded. Was it a clean shutdown or a dirty one? Did she scream or did she choke? A few of the younger mechanics shifted uncomfortably. They had been there, they had heard it, but they had never thought to describe it in such a way. Westbrook began, then collected himself. The data log shows a sudden, complete loss of power. Any strange smells? McKinnon asked, his eyes now scanning the hydraulic lines running along the chassis. Burnt fluid, ozone, anything sharp, Westbrook scoffed, regaining his footing. This is the primitive nonsense I expected. Sir, we're well beyond smells and vibrations. This is a 1,700 horsepower gas turbine engine, not my grandfather's lawnmower. The onboard computer monitors thousands of metrics per second. If there was an issue, it would have been logged. The computer only knows what you tell it to look for, McKinnon said softly, almost to himself. The metal sound of his Zippo clicking open and closed again seemed to trigger something deep in his memory. For a fleeting second, the gray, overcast sky of the Colorado morning vanished, replaced by a blinding, sandblasted sun. February 1991, the Iraqi desert stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of tan and gold under a merciless sky. Operation Desert Storm was entering its ground phase, and Sergeant Frank McKinnon, then 42, found himself manning the mechanical systems of an M1 Abrams with the 2nd Armored Regiment. The air inside the tank was thick with the smell of diesel, and fear a cocktail of sensations all too familiar to a combat mechanic. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of screaming shells and the terrifying roar of an Iraqi Republican Guard tank company cresting the dune 300 meters to their east. His tank call sign Ripper 6 had taken 2 direct hits from enemy T-72s. The rounds hadn't penetrated the composite armor, but they had knocked out communications and disabled the advanced fire control systems. His commander's voice, crackling over the backup radio, warned of imminent overrun. They were cut off from their unit, alone in a sea of enemy armor. McKinnon had dropped down into the engine compartment, a cramped hell of heat and machinery. The main hydraulic system was losing pressure fast, and without it, the turret would be immobilized, turning their state-of-the-art battle tank into a 60-ton coffin. In the darkness, there was only one pinprick of light, the tiny flickering flame of his trusty Zippo. It illuminated a hairline crack in a secondary fuel line, so small that the advanced diagnostics of the day had missed it completely. The escaping fuel was spraying onto a hot manifold, vaporizing instantly, reducing pressure to the hydraulic pump. With the desperate, frantic work of bleeding hands, he bypassed the cracked line using a clamp salvaged from a broken radio mount. His knuckles were bloody, his lungs burning with diesel fumes, his heart hammering against his ribs as he made the jury-rigged repair. "Come on, baby," he whispered to the engine as he hit the ignition override, a prayer more than a command. The turbine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a scream that sounded like salvation. McKinnon scrambled back up to the gunner's position just as the first enemy, T-72, appeared in his sights, its turret traversing toward them. With the manual backup sights, he laid the crosshairs on the Iraqi tank's vulnerable side armor and squeezed the trigger. The Abrams rocked backward as its 120mm smoothbore cannon erupted, sending a depleted uranium sabot round through the air at over 1 mile per second. The T-72 erupted in a fireball as the round penetrated its thinner side armor, igniting ammunition stored in the turret. Without pausing, McKinnon traversed to the next target, and the next, and the next. 7 enemy tanks in total, each one a silhouette against the desert sun, each one transformed into a column of black smoke and flame by his gunner's skill and the awesome power of American engineering. What McKinnon couldn't know in that moment was that his actions would change the course of the battle. The destruction of those 7 tanks created a gap in the Iraqi lines, allowing elements of the 2nd Armored to penetrate deep behind enemy positions. The Battle of 73 Easting, as it would come to be known, became one of the most decisive tank engagements since World War II, and somewhere in the after-action reports a legend began to form around the mechanic who had fixed his tank under fire and single-handedly held off an enemy company. The memory, vivid and violent, was gone in an instant. McKinnon's eyes, which for a moment had reflected the fire and terror of battle, were once again calm and steady. He snapped the Zippo shut and returned it to his pocket. Westbrook was still talking, his voice a distant drone of technical specifications and procedural justifications. McKinnon tuned back in just as the lieutenant was wrapping up his explanation of why the entire power pack would need to be removed and replaced. So, as you can see, Westbrook concluded with the confidence of a man who believes he has won an argument through sheer volume of words. We've explored every possible avenue. The tank is down hard. It needs a full rebuild. McKinnon looked past the lieutenant directly at one of the tank crew members who had been hovering at the edge of the gathering. You were in her when she went down. The tank crewman, Sergeant William Cooper, a stocky man in his mid-30s with close-cropped hair, straightened up in surprise. In all the technical discussions, no one had bothered to ask the crew about their experience. Yes, sir, I was. Acting crew chief for this exercise. Tell me what you heard right before she quit. Cooper hesitated, glancing at Westbrook, then back at McKinnon. There was a high-pitched whine, sir, coming from the hydraulic system, I think. Not the normal turbine sound. Higher, like a... He searched for the comparison, like a tea kettle about to boil over. Then she just died. No warning lights, no alarms. Just silence. McKinnon nodded as if Cooper had just confirmed something important. Westbrook rolled his eyes. Sergeant Cooper, while your observations are noted, the diagnostic systems are designed to catch and log any anomalous sounds or vibrations. The FAA deck system monitors acoustic signatures across multiple frequency bands. Have you ever heard the sound of a baffle plate collapsing inside a primary hydraulic reservoir? McKinnon asked quietly. The question stopped Westbrook mid-sentence. What? It makes a sound like a tea kettle right before it blocks the main outlet and starves the pump. McKinnon was walking again, this time with purpose, heading toward the access panel near the turret ring. Westbrook recovered quickly. That's absurd. A baffle failure would trigger pressure warning sensors throughout the system. We'd see cascading alerts. Not if it fell in a way that created a gradual restriction rather than a sudden blockage. McKinnon knelt down beside the tank, his old knees protesting with a faint creak. The pump would still build initial pressure enough to clear the sensor thresholds during startup, but then lose it under load. The humiliation was becoming a spectacle. Other soldiers, drawn by the unusual sight of a civilian being given access to a broken main battle tank, began to gather at a respectful distance. Their whispers created a low hum beneath the tension. They could feel the friction between the two men, the clash of two entirely different worlds. It was now 8:15 a.m., exactly 44 hours before the decisive strike exercise was set to begin. The clock continued its merciless countdown, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath it. Sergeant Cooper had been watching the exchange with growing interest. There was something familiar about the old man, something that hugged at the edges of his memory. When McKinnon had pulled out that Zippo with 2nd Armored emblem, a spark of recognition had flared in Cooper's mind. Then he saw it, a small, faded tattoo on McKinnon's forearm, partially visible when his sleeve rode up as he gestured. The tattoo showed a simple coordinate 73 Easting. Cooper's breath caught in his throat. He'd heard the stories. Every tanker had. The ghost of 73 Easting, they called him. The mechanic who'd fixed his tank under enemy fire and taken out 7 Iraqi T-72s. Could it really be him? Here, without drawing attention, Cooper slipped away from the gathering. He needed to make a call, and he needed to make it now. Westbrook had decided he'd had enough. This old man wasn't just wasting his time. He was undermining his authority in front of his team, and now half the motor pool. He stepped forward, planting himself between McKinnon and the tank. Mr. McKinnon, I appreciate your willingness to help, but this is a waste of valuable time. My team is ready to begin prepping the tank for transport to the depot. Please step aside. McKinnon rose slowly to his feet, looking Westbrook directly in the eye. There was no anger there, no challenge, just a patient certainty that comes from decades of experience. A tank isn't just data points, son. It talks to you through its sounds, its vibrations, its smells. You've been taught to trust the readout more than your senses. That's your limitation, not the tanks. Westbrook's face flushed red. Being lectured about tanks by a civilian was bad enough, but having it happen in front of his team and a growing audience of soldiers was intolerable. Can you imagine what it feels like to stand face to face with a living legend and not even know it? To dismiss as obsolete the very person whose methods have saved countless lives. It's a special kind of irony that plays out every day as the young and tech-savvy push aside the wisdom of experience in favor of the latest gadget or algorithm. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner behind a row of Humvees, Sergeant Cooper had his cell phone pressed to his ear, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Master Sergeant Davis, this is Sergeant Cooper, 3rd Brigade Combat Team. Sir, you're not going to believe this. Frank Ghost McKinnon is here at our depot. Yes, the McKinnon. Lieutenant Westbrook is about to have him thrown off the base. The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Cooper could almost feel the pressure building through the phone. The game had just changed. He didn't know the details of what would happen next, but he knew with absolute certainty that the cavalry was coming. Miles away in a cluttered office at the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Benning, Master Sergeant Robert Davis slammed his phone down with enough force to make the plastic groan. His face a roadmap of a 30-year career etched with the sands of Iraq, and the winters of Grafenbohr was flushed with a deep, furious red. "Are you kidding me?" he roared to the empty room. His aide, a young captain, poked his head in, his eyes wide with alarm. "Everything all right, Master Sergeant?" Davis stomped across the room to a wall covered in decades of plaques, unit photos, and commendations. It was a shrine to the Armored Corps. His finger, thick as a sausage, jabbed at a faded photograph from 1991. In it, a group of young tankers, their faces smeared with soot and lit by triumphant grins, stood in front of an M1 Abrams. The tank's barrel was adorned with 7 crudely painted enemy tank silhouettes. In the center of the group, looking impossibly young, was the man who had just been described to him over the phone. "Captain," Davis growled, his voice a low rumble of controlled fury. "You see that man? That is Frank Ghost McKinnon. When you were learning your multiplication tables, he was writing half the damn maintenance manuals for the A1 variant from a fighting position." He turned, eyes blazing. "The battlefield recovery techniques we teach to every single 91 alpha mechanic in this army. He didn't learn them in a classroom. He pioneered them under fire with his hands and his wits. And Cooper just told me that some pencil-neck lieutenant with a shiny new laptop is trying to have him removed from the depot." The captain's face went pale. "What do you want me to do, Master Sergeant?" "Get me General Patterson on the line now," Davis barked, "and get a vehicle ready. Tell the general's office that the ghost of 73 Easting is being disrespected by one of his new officers. Use those exact words." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, the ghost of 73. Easting, it wasn't a call sign, it was a title, a piece of living history. Back at Fort Carson, the confrontation was escalating. Westbrook had moved from dismissive to openly hostile, his professional facade cracking under the strain of being questioned. "Mr. McKinnon," he said, his voice rising, "this is a restricted military area. You are interfering with official operations. If you don't step aside, I will have to ask you to leave the depot." McKinnon didn't move. Instead, he looked at the hydraulic reservoir near the base of the turret ring, a component so basic, so low-tech that Westbrook's advanced diagnostics would have overlooked it as a potential cause for a total system failure. "Humans think machines only speak through code and data," McKinnon said quietly. "But they have their own language, sounds, and vibrations and heat. You have to learn to listen." This philosophical approach was the final straw for Westbrook. He turned to 2 of his junior engineers, big strapping kids, who looked deeply uncomfortable with their new role. "Walker Ramirez, please escort Mr. McKinnon to the gate." Colonel Harrington, who had been observing from a distance, made no move to intervene. The pressure from above was enormous. If the tank wasn't operational in time for decisive strike, his career was finished. As much as he respected McKinnon, he couldn't afford to back an unorthodox approach if Westbrook's by-the-book method was the only guaranteed solution, even if that solution meant mission failure. The clock on the wall now read 40:17:32. Time was running out. The 2 young engineers approached McKinnon reluctantly. This wasn't what they had signed up for. In the background, Cooper had returned, his face tense. He pulled out his phone again, fingers flying across the screen. SOS, they're escorting Ghost out. McKinnon still hadn't moved. His eyes remained fixed on that hydraulic reservoir, seeing something that the others couldn't or wouldn't see. The entire depot seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Westbrook decided to deliver the final blow himself, a clear and public reassertion of his authority. He strode forward, stopping directly in front of McKinnon. Sir, for the final time, I am ordering you to vacate this restricted military area. Your presence is interfering with official operations. If you refuse to comply, I will have the military police detain you. Is that clear? He had crossed the Rubicon. The threat of arrest made to a civilian guest of a full colonel was an overreach so profound that a hush fell over the entire assembly of soldiers. The whispers stopped. The mechanics froze. This was no longer a simple jurisdictional spat. It was a public and brutal humiliation of an old man. McKinnon simply gave a slow, sad shake of his head. He looked past Westbrook toward the silent tank as if to say he was sorry. It began as a low rumble, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It was a sound every soldier on that base knew well, the sound of heavy vehicles moving at speed. But this wasn't the whine of MP patrol cars. This was deeper, more menacing. Heads turned toward the main road leading into the depot. Within seconds, a convoy of black command vehicles and sand-colored Humvees came into view, moving far too fast for the confines of the base. They didn't slow down as they approached the maintenance area. Instead, they fanned out and screeched to a halt in a perfectly executed tactical formation, their tires kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. The entire motor pool was suddenly enveloped in an atmosphere of crisis. Doors flew open with synchronized precision, and out stepped a two-star general, his uniform immaculate, his bearing radiating an aura of absolute command. He was flanked by the furiously looking Master Sergeant Davis and a retinue of senior NCOs and officers, men whose chests were heavy with ribbons and whose faces were set like stone. They moved as one, a wave of rank and righteous anger rolling across the concrete. Every soldier in the vicinity, from the lowest private to Colonel Harrington, snapped to the position of attention. Jaws hung open in shock. Lieutenant Westbrook, who had been puffed up with his own authority just moments before, seemed to shrink, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd mistaken a hornet's nest for a football. The two-star general, whose nameplate read Patterson, completely ignored Westbrook. He ignored Colonel Harrington. His eyes, like laser sights, were locked on one person, only the old man in the greasy coveralls. He strode across the tarmac, his boots echoing with purpose, and stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Frank McKinnon. In the dead silence, he brought his hand up in the sharpest, most impeccably respectful salute of his long career. His voice, a commander's baritone accustomed to booming across parade grounds, was clear and strong. Sergeant McKinnon, General Patterson, it is a distinct honor, sir. Have you ever witnessed the moment when someone who has been dismissed and disrespected is suddenly shown the highest form of reverence? It's like watching the world realign itself around a truth that was always there but hidden from most eyes. In that moment, every assumption is questioned, every judgment reconsidered. McKinnon, looking slightly taken aback by the sudden fanfare, returned a slow, tired nod. The salute from a two-star general to a retired sergeant was so far outside military protocol that it created a surreal tableau frozen in time. Every eye in the depot was locked on this unlikely scene, the weathered old man in stained coveralls receiving the highest form of military respect from one of the most senior officers on base. Then Master Sergeant Davis stepped forward, positioning himself so he was looking directly into Lieutenant Westbrook's terrified eyes. His voice was not loud, but it was cold as steel and carried the weight of 30 years of authority. Lieutenant, he began, letting the rank hang in the air like an accusation. You stand there with your tablet and your degree, and you see an old man. You see a problem for your flowchart. He paused, letting the entire motor pool lean in. Let me tell you what I see. Davis squared his shoulders, every inch the senior NCO, the backbone of the Army. I see the man who, during Operation Desert Storm, had his tank platoon cut off and ambushed in the Battle of 73 Easting. A ripple went through the crowd. 73 Easting was the stuff of legend in armored warfare circles taught at West Point and every military academy around the world. It was to modern tank warfare what Midway was to naval combat. I see the man whose tank took 2 direct hits from enemy T-72s, disabling his communications and his advanced fire control system. Davis continued, his voice gathering strength. While under continuous hellacious fire, this old man crawled into his own engine compartment, manually diagnosed and repaired a severed hydraulic line, and single-handedly restored power to his turret. A collective gasp went through the crowd of soldiers. They were no longer just watching a confrontation. They were witnesses to the unveiling of a myth made flesh. He then proceeded to manually sight and destroy 7, let me repeat that, 7 frontline enemy tanks. He didn't have a laptop to tell him what was wrong. Lieutenant, Davis continued, his voice dripping with scorn. He did it with a standard-issue wrench, a spare hose, and the Zippo lighter he still carries in his pocket, which he used for light. Westbrook looked as though he might be physically ill. His face had gone from pale to ashen, his tablet hanging limply at his side like a forgotten toy. And when it was over, Davis continued, lowering his voice to ensure everyone strained to hear. He didn't write a report asking for a medal. He wrote the new emergency repair procedure for the entire M1 fleet, a procedure that saved countless American lives and tanks for the next 30 years. Davis turned to face the assembled crowd, making sure his next words reached every ear. This man is not a civilian. He is not a liability. He is a living, breathing legend of the United States Armor Corps. And you, son, he turned back to Westbrook, just tried to have him thrown out like a piece of trash. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the bass. The soldiers stared at McKinnon with a new, profound reverence. He was no longer just an old man. He was the ghost of 73, easting a figure of battlefield lore made flesh. Sergeant Cooper, the tanker, who made the call, felt a surge of pride so intense it almost brought him to his knees. Westbrook's team of young engineers looked at the ground, their faces burning with a shame that was almost painful to watch. General Patterson then turned his glacial gaze upon Lieutenant Westbrook. The air around them seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Lieutenant," the general said, his voice deceptively calm, "you have a degree from MIT. That is commendable." Westbrook swallowed hard but remained at rigid attention. "It teaches you how a machine is supposed to work," Patterson continued. "Men like Mr. McKinnon here," he gestured to the old mechanic, "they understand how a machine actually works, especially when it's broken on fire and surrounded by people who are actively trying to kill you." Patterson moved a step closer to Westbrook, his voice dropping to an intimate level that somehow made his words more devastating. "You, son, have confused knowledge with wisdom. You showed arrogance where you should have shown humility, and you showed contempt for the very experience this army is built upon." The rebuke was total, a public and devastating dressing down that would follow Westbrook for the rest of his career. But then the general said something unexpected. "You will report to Master Sergeant Davis tomorrow morning at 500 hours. He is going to personally re-educate you on the meaning of respect, and you will learn it from the ground up." It was a career that had just been saved from obliteration and put on a path to redemption, though Westbrook didn't know it yet. The general could have ended his military future with a word, but instead had offered a brutal form of grace. All eyes then turned to McKinnon, the quiet center of the storm. He finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying easily in the charged silence. He wasn't looking at Westbrook or the general. He was looking at the tank. "It's not the boy's fault, General," he said, his voice full of a surprising gentleness. "He's been taught to trust the computer. He's been taught to look at the numbers. But a tank," he patted the cold steel of the Abrams, "a tank has a soul. It groans and shivers and complains long before it gives up. You just have to learn how to listen." He then turned and met Lieutenant Westbrook's gaze. There was no malice in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only the quiet patience of a master craftsman looking at a struggling apprentice. "You ran all the diagnostics," McKinnon said. "But did you talk to the crew? Did you ask Sergeant Cooper, hear what he heard in those final seconds, what he felt through the floor plates?" Westbrook, stripped of all his intellectual pride, could only shake his head. The next 30 minutes formed themselves into a blur in Westbrook's memory, a surreal sequence of events that would later seem like a dream or a nightmare. McKinnon returned to his examination of the tank, while General Patterson and Colonel Harrington conferred in low voices nearby. The assembled crowd of soldiers and mechanics remained held in place by the gravity of the unfolding drama and the rare opportunity to see a living legend at work. Westbrook stood rooted to the spot, unable to process the complete upheaval of his reality. Just an hour ago, he had been the confident expert, the man with all the answers. Now he was revealed as not just wrong, but arrogant and disrespectful to a hero of the very branch he served. "Lieutenant," a voice broke through his daze. It was McKinnon looking at him with an expression that contained neither triumph nor condescension. "Would you bring me the service record for this tank?" Westbrook blinked, surprised by the request and the fact that it had been directed at him rather than one of the mechanics. "Yes, sir," he replied automatically, the "sir" slipping out unbidden, a recognition of authority that transcended rank. As Westbrook hurried to retrieve the records, McKinnon returned to his methodical examination of the Abrams. His movements were slow but precise, each touch and glance informed by decades of hands-on experience. "Sergeant Cooper," McKinnon called, "tell me again about that sound you heard. The high-pitched whine. Did it start suddenly or build gradually?" Cooper stepped forward, eager to assist. "It built up, sir, over maybe 10-15 seconds. Started like a whistle, then got higher until it was almost painful. Then everything just stopped." McKinnon nodded, his fingers tracing a path along the hydraulic lines that fed into the turret rotation mechanism. "And where exactly were you sitting when you heard it?" "Gunner's position, sir." "So directly above the hydraulic reservoir for the turret ring." Cooper's eyes widened as the connection became clear. "Yes, sir. Exactly there." McKinnon smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "That's your confirmation right there." At Fort Benning, years before smart tablets and advanced diagnostic software had become standard issue, McKinnon had taught a generation of tank mechanics how to identify problems using all their senses. In a classroom filled with eager young soldiers, he had demonstrated the distinct sounds of various failure modes. "A machine will tell you what's wrong if you learn its language," he had told them, playing recorded sounds of engines under stress. "The computer will tell you the result of the failure, but your ears and hands will help you find the cause." He had written manuals and developed training programs that blended technical knowledge with practical experience. His emergency repair protocols had been implemented throughout the Armor Corps, saving lives and equipment in conflicts from Desert Storm to the early days in Afghanistan and Iraq. But as technology advanced, as computers became more sophisticated and diagnostic tools more automated, the Army had gradually shifted away from the hands-on approach McKinnon championed. Young officers like Westbrook were trained to trust the readout more than their instincts, to follow the flowchart rather than feel the machine's pulse. It wasn't entirely Westbrook's fault. He was a product of his training, a man who had been taught that technology had surpassed intuition, that data had rendered experience obsolete. In another era, he might have been a fine officer, but he had been raised in a world where the answer always came from a screen. Isn't this the kind of experience you can't find in textbooks? The wisdom earned through dirt and steel and blood, passed down from one generation to the next, not through algorithms, but through stories and scars and shared suffering. Westbrook returned with the tank's service record, a thick digital file on his tablet. McKinnon glanced at it, but seemed more interested in the young lieutenant's demeanor than the data he carried. "Thank you," he said, taking the tablet. He scrolled through it briefly, nodding to himself. "Just as I thought. This tank had its hydraulic system overhauled 3 months ago. Brand new components." "Yes, sir," Westbrook confirmed. "Complete level 2 maintenance at the depot in Anniston." "New components sometimes fail in unexpected ways," McKinnon mused, "especially when they're installed by technicians who are following a checklist rather than understanding the system as a whole." He handed the tablet back to Westbrook and turned to the small crowd of engineers and mechanics that had gathered around. "Listen up," he said, his voice taking on the natural authority of a seasoned instructor. "I want to show you something that won't be in your manual." McKinnon led them to the rear of the tank, pointing to a small access panel near the turret ring. "The primary hydraulic reservoir for the turret drive system sits right here. It has an internal baffle plate to prevent fluid surge during rapid movements." He knelt down, groaning slightly as his knees protested. "These new composite baffles can crack under certain stress conditions. When they do, they sometimes collapse inward, blocking the main outlet to the pump." General Patterson and Colonel Harrington had moved closer, listening with the same attention as the junior mechanics. This was a master class delivered by one of the foremost experts in armored warfare mechanics. The interesting thing, McKinnon continued, is that this kind of failure won't trigger the standard pressure sensors. The system still builds initial pressure during startup, clearing the safety thresholds. But under load, when the turret tries to rotate quickly, the fluid flow gets restricted. The pump cavitates, creating that high-pitched whine Sergeant Cooper heard, and then the whole system shuts down to prevent damage. But the diagnostics system reported a complete power unit failure. Westbrook objected, then immediately regretted speaking. McKinnon nodded, not at all offended by the interruption. Of course it did, because from the computer's perspective, that's what happened. The engine control unit detected a critical hydraulic pressure drop and initiated an emergency shutdown. The result is a power failure. The cause is this baffle plate. Westbrook's face showed the dawning of understanding. It was as if scales were falling from his eyes. "Give me a heavy torque wrench," McKinnon requested. A large, heavy wrench was passed to him, its steel surface gleaming with oil. As his hand closed around the tool, one final brief memory flashed through his mind. The desert sun again, but this time there was no battle. He was standing in a line of soldiers being recognized for valor. But his commanding officer wasn't pinning a medal on his chest. Instead, he pressed a heavy, brand-new torque wrench into his hand. "The Army gives out medals, Ghost," the officer had said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Tankers give tools. Never trust a man who hasn't skinned his own knuckles." McKinnon raised the wrench and tapped it against the reservoir's metal casing. Instead of the clear, high-pitched ping of solid steel, the wrench produced a dull, flat thud. He tapped it again. Thud. He looked up at the assembled group of engineers, mechanics, and high-ranking officers. "There's your problem," he said simply. The entire motor pool had become his classroom. "The computer is telling you the engine failed because it's reading a catastrophic pressure drop in the starter system. And it's right. The pressure is dropping to zero." He tapped the reservoir again. "But it's not the pump that's failing. It's this. There's a collapsed baffle inside this primary hydraulic reservoir. It's a simple $50 part, probably failed from metal fatigue. It's fallen down and is blocking the main fluid outlet. The pump is being choked, starved of the fluid it needs to build pressure for the turbine starter motor." McKinnon then pointed to a series of valves. "You can bypass it. Rig a temporary line from the secondary reservoir directly to the starter motor. It'll give you enough juice for one good start. Once it's running, the engine's own alternator will power the systems." He looked at Westbrook. "It's a 3-hour fix to replace the baffle, not 3 weeks." Davenport and his team of engineers watched mesmerized as the old master, with the help of Sergeant Cooper, quickly and efficiently rigged the bypass line. It was a piece of elegant, practical improvisation that wasn't in any of their manuals. Within 10 minutes, it was done. McKinnon stepped back and gave a nod to Cooper, who was already in the crew chief's position. "Try her now." Cooper hit the ignition. For a second, there was only the high-pitched whine of the electronics. Then, with a deep guttural cough, the 1,500 horsepower turbine engine caught. It roared to life with a deafening blast of sound and a plume of heat that sent a shimmer through the air. The M1 Abrams, the dead behemoth, was alive. A spontaneous, thunderous cheer erupted from the assembled soldiers. Men who had been skeptical minutes ago were now looking at McKinnon with something approaching awe. This was a display of mechanical wizardry that transcended rank and protocol. In the aftermath, things changed rapidly. General Patterson, true to his word, mandated a new training module for all junior engineering officers across the armor branch. It would focus on sensory diagnostics, crew interviews, and hands-on problem-solving before ever plugging in a computer. "We're going to call it the McKinnon method," Patterson announced to nods of approval from the senior NCOs. "And we're bringing Mr. McKinnon on as a civilian consultant to help develop the curriculum." McKinnon seemed amused by the title. "Seems a bit formal for just listening to what a machine is telling you," he said with a small smile. "Sometimes the old ways need fancy new names to get the attention they deserve," Patterson replied. As for Lieutenant Westbrook, his fate was sealed, but not in the way he had feared. He was not drummed out of the service. Instead, he was remade by it. "You have potential, Lieutenant," Master Sergeant Davis told him as they walked away from the now bustling scene around the tank. "But you've been trained to see the world through a screen. We're going to fix that." Westbrook's expression was a complex mixture of relief, shame, and determination. Yes, Master Sergeant, he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Starting tomorrow, you belong to me, Davis continued. 6 months of intensive retraining. You'll learn every inch of these machines with your hands, not your tablet. You'll crawl through engine compartments until you can identify every component by touch in the dark. You'll listen to engines until you can diagnose a problem by sound alone. He fixed Westbrook with a stern but not unkind gaze. And most importantly, you'll learn the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between data and understanding, between a flowchart and 30 years of hard-won experience. The general's convoy departed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a transformed motor pool. The tank was operational, the crisis averted, but the impact of McKinnon's visit would reverberate long after he was gone. Colonel Harrington approached McKinnon as the crowd began to disperse. "Frank," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I should have stepped in sooner." McKinnon shook his head. "You had your own pressures, James. No need for apologies between old friends." "Still," Harrington insisted, "what happened here today? It shouldn't have come to that. I let protocol and chain of command override my better judgment." "The boy needed to learn a lesson," McKinnon said, glancing in the direction where Westbrook had departed with Davis. "Sometimes those lessons come hard." "Will you really consider the consultant position?" Harrington asked. "The pay is excellent, and God knows we need your expertise." McKinnon smiled. "I'll think about it. Might be nice to have something to do besides watching the grass grow." As the day wound down, the maintenance depot returned to a semblance of normalcy. The Abrams tank was undergoing a proper repair of its hydraulic system, with a team of mechanics now eager to learn the hands-on techniques that McKinnon had demonstrated. Sergeant Cooper found himself in an unexpected position of prominence. Word of his role in the day's events had spread, and fellow tankers were approaching him with a new respect. "You recognized him," one private said in awe. "You knew who he was?" Cooper nodded. "My uncle served in Desert Storm. He told me stories about the ghost of 73 Easting. Said he could hear a tank's heartbeat fix anything with nothing but a wrench and pure grit." "I thought those were just tall tales," the private admitted. "Sometimes the tall tales are true," Cooper replied, watching as McKinnon gathered his few belongings preparing to leave the depot. "Sometimes the legends walk among us, and we're too blind to see them." As McKinnon made his way toward the exit, soldiers stopped what they were doing to nod respectfully or offer quiet thanks. He acknowledged each one with the same modest grace he had shown throughout the day. Near the gate, he found Lieutenant Westbrook waiting for him. The young officer was standing rigidly at attention, his face composed but his eyes revealing the internal struggle of a man confronting his own limitations. "Mr. McKinnon," Westbrook said as the older man approached, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. I was, he faltered, searching for words that could adequately express the depth of his remorse and embarrassment. McKinnon stopped before him. "At ease, Lieutenant. You don't need to apologize to me." "Sir, I disrespected you. I tried to have you removed from the base. I was arrogant and dismissive." "Yes, you were," McKinnon agreed calmly, "but not because you're a bad officer, because you're a product of your training, and that training has gaps." Westbrook blinked, surprised by this assessment. "The Army taught you to trust the readout, to follow the protocol, to believe in the system," McKinnon continued. "Those aren't bad things in themselves, but they're incomplete." He looked back toward the distant shape of the Abrams tank now surrounded by mechanics. "A machine isn't just circuits and metal. It's a living thing in its way. It has moods and quirks. It tells you when it's hurting if you know how to listen." McKinnon turned his weathered blue eyes back to Westbrook. "Master Sergeant Davis is a tough teacher, but a fair one. Learn from him. Not just the technical stuff, but the feel of it, the soul of it." "I will, sir," Westbrook promised, and for the first time that day, he seemed to truly mean what he said. McKinnon nodded, satisfied. "Good man. Now I expect you've got work to do." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Westbrook hesitated, then added, "Will I see you again during the training program, I mean?" A slight smile crossed McKinnon's face. "I suspect you might. Seems they want to put this old dog back to work." As McKinnon walked away, Westbrook remained standing by the gate, watching until the old mechanic's figure disappeared around a corner. Something fundamental had shifted in the lieutenant's worldview, a crack in the edifice of technical certainty that had defined his approach to his profession and perhaps his life. The sun was beginning to set over Fort Carson, casting long shadows across the parade grounds and maintenance facilities. In the motor pool, the Abrams tank's engine rumbled contentedly, a beast brought back from the brink. The clock that had counted down the hours to decisive strike now showed 35:42:19, more than enough time to complete the repairs and prepare for deployment. Crisis averted. Mission saved. But for the men and women who had witnessed the events of that extraordinary day, something more significant had occurred. They had seen the living embodiment of the warrior ethos, not in a battle against a human enemy, but in the quiet, competent hands of a man who understood that mastery comes not from data, but from devotion, not from protocols, but from passion. And in the fading light of day, a legend once forgotten had been reborn. In a quiet office at the back of the motor pool, Colonel Harrington sat down heavily at his desk. The events of the day had taken a toll emotionally more than physically. He pulled out his secure phone and dialed a number from memory. General Patterson's office, a crisp voice answered. "This is Colonel Harrington. I need to speak with the general." A brief pause. "One moment, sir." Patterson's voice came on the line. "James, how's our tank?" "Fully operational, sir. They're finishing the permanent repair now. We'll be ready for decisive strike with time to spare." "Excellent. And what about our young lieutenant?" Harrington sighed. "In shock, I think. But Master Sergeant Davis has him well in hand." "Good. He needs to be broken down and built back up the right way. Too much book learning, not enough trench wisdom." "Sir, about McKinnon," Harrington began. "What about him, eh?" There was an edge to Patterson's voice. "He's agreed to consider the consultant position. But, sir, there is something else we should do." "I'm listening." "That emergency repair procedure he developed after 73 Easting. It saved countless lives, countless vehicles. But he never received any formal recognition for it." There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Patterson spoke. "You're right, James. That's an oversight that needs correction. Leave it with me." As the call ended, Harrington leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes it took a crisis to remind you of what truly mattered, of the values that formed the bedrock of the institution he had served for decades. Technology changed, weapon systems evolved, but the heart of the military remained the same people. Men and women whose courage, skill, and wisdom couldn't be replaced by algorithms or artificial intelligence. Frank McKinnon had reminded them all of that today without ever intending to. He had simply done what he had always done, listened to a machine's complaints, and fixed what ailed it. In doing so, he had fixed something larger, something that had been slowly breaking down in the culture of the modern army, the ghost of 73. Easting had returned not to haunt them, but to heal them. Do we sometimes rely too much on technology and forget the value of hard-won experience? Are we losing the tactile connection to the world, the ability to diagnose problems with our senses rather than our screens? Perhaps there's a lesson here for all of us, not just for Lieutenant Westbrook and his fellow officers. The old ways and the new need not be in conflict. They can complement each other, the precision of technology enhanced by the intuition of experience, the efficiency of automation guided by the wisdom of those who have walked the path before us. As night fell over Fort Carson, the stars emerged in the clear Colorado sky, the same stars that had shone down on McKinnon in the Iraqi desert all those years ago. The battle may have changed, the technology may have advanced, but some truths remained eternal. The value of listening, the importance of respect, the irreplaceable worth of wisdom earned through years of devoted service. And sometimes, just sometimes, legends do walk among us. We just need to learn how to see them. As dawn broke over the eastern edge of Fort Carson, Lieutenant Michael Westbrook was already awake. Sleep had been elusive, his mind replaying the events of the previous day in an endless loop of humiliation and revelation. He stood in his quarters, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the man who looked back at him. His reflection showed a changed man. Yesterday's certainty, the comfortable arrogance of a top-tier education, had been replaced by something both unsettling and necessary doubt. Not the paralyzing kind, but the humble awareness that the world contained wisdom his algorithms couldn't capture. It was 0430 hours. In 30 minutes, he would report to Master Sergeant Davis for the first day of what the sergeant had ominously called his re-education. Westbrook straightened his uniform, checking each detail with meticulous care. If nothing else, he could control this small aspect of his world. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from one of his team members, Engineer Ramirez. "Good luck today, sir. We're all pulling for you." The simple message touched Westbrook more deeply than he would have expected. His team wasn't abandoning him despite his very public dressing down. It was a small mercy in what promised to be a grueling day. At exactly 0500 hours, Westbrook presented himself at the maintenance bay where Master Sergeant Davis waited. The older NCO stood ramrod straight, his face impassive as Westbrook approached and saluted. "Lieutenant Westbrook reporting as ordered, Master Sergeant." Davis returned the salute with precision. "On time. That's a start." He gestured to a workbench where a disassembled hydraulic system lay in neatly arranged components. "Your first lesson begins now." For the next 4 hours, Westbrook found himself immersed in the physical reality of tank mechanics in a way his technical training had never prepared him for. Davis was a demanding instructor, but not a cruel one. He didn't berate Westbrook or attempt to humiliate him further. Instead, he adopted the stern patience of a master craftsman, correcting mistakes firmly but constructively. "Feel this," Davis commanded, placing Westbrook's hand on a hydraulic fitting. "Not with your fingertips, your whole palm." "What do you feel?" "It's warm," Westbrook answered hesitantly. "Exactly. Now this one." Davis moved Westbrook's hand to an identical-looking fitting. "Cooler." "Good. Why, they?" Westbrook frowned, thinking through the fluid dynamics, the transfer of heat, the mechanics of the system. "The first one has fluid actively flowing through it. The second is restricted or blocked." Davis nodded, the barest hint of approval showing in his eyes. "You've got the theory. Now you need to develop the touch, the feel. This is something your computer can't tell you. It's something you have to experience." As the morning progressed, Westbrook found himself developing a new appreciation for the tactile dimension of his profession. His hands, once most comfortable holding a tablet, began to learn the language of metal and fluid, of vibration and heat. "There's a wisdom in your hands that your brain hasn't caught up to yet," Davis told him during a brief break. "You've been taught to think, analyze, compute. Those are valuable skills. But a good mechanic, a good officer, needs to feel as well." By midday, Westbrook's uniform was stained with grease, his hands dirty in a way that no amount of washing seemed to remove. But there was something strangely satisfying about the grime, as if it were a visible sign of a transformation taking place. In the officers' mess hall, Westbrook sat alone, conscious of the glances and whispers from his fellow officers. Word had spread quickly about his encounter with the legendary Frank McKinnon and the subsequent intervention of General Patterson. He was now both a cautionary tale and an object of curiosity. Colonel Harrington entered the mess hall and, after getting his food, deliberately walked to Westbrook's table. "Mind if I join you, Lieutenant?" Westbrook immediately began to rise. "Sir, of course not." Harrington waved him back down. "Relax, Michael. This isn't an official visit." As the colonel settled in across from him, Westbrook couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in Harrington's demeanor. The day before, the colonel had seemed distant, constrained by the pressures of command. Today, there was an openness to his expression, a weight that had been lifted. "How was your morning with Master Sergeant Davis?" Harrington asked, cutting into his meal. "Educational, sir," Westbrook replied carefully. Harrington chuckled. "I bet it was. Davis is old school. Tough, but fair." "Yes, sir." The colonel studied Westbrook for a moment. "You know, I served with McKinnon in Desert Storm. Different unit, but we crossed paths a few times. Even then, he had that ability, that almost mystical connection with machinery." Westbrook nodded, eager to hear more about the man who had so dramatically altered his understanding of his profession. "After the battle at 73 Easting, word of what he did spread through the entire theater," Harrington continued. "Some thought it was exaggerated. 7 enemy tanks taken out by a single disabled Abrams. It sounded impossible. But then the battle damage assessments came in, and there they were. 7 destroyed T-72s in a neat arc around his position." The colonel's eyes took on a distant look as he remembered. "I saw him a few weeks later at the forward operating base. He wasn't celebrating like you might expect. He was in the maintenance depot teaching other mechanics his bypass technique. Said it was more important than the kills." Westbrook absorbed this information, adding it to his growing understanding of McKinnon. "Sir, may I ask a question?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't he receive more recognition for what he did, I mean?" Harrington sighed. That's a complicated question with a simple answer. McKinnon didn't want it. When they tried to put him in for a Silver Star, he refused. Said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back. He would only accept a commendation for the repair procedure he developed. The colonel leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. Between you and me, I think General Patterson is working on correcting that oversight. Some recognition is long overdue, whether McKinnon wants it or not. As they finished their meal, Harrington fixed Westbrook with a serious look. Lieutenant, yesterday was a hard lesson, but if you learn from it, it could be the most valuable one of your career. I intend to, sir, Westbrook replied with genuine conviction. Good man, carry on. As Westbrook returned to the maintenance bay for his afternoon session with Davis, his mind was filled with new perspectives and questions. The simplistic view he had held of technology superseding experience of data, replacing intuition, was crumbling, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between old and new, between knowledge and wisdom. Meanwhile, in a small, neat house on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, Frank McKinnon was engaged in his own reflection on the previous day's events. He sat on his back porch, a cup of black coffee cooling on the table beside him, watching the distant mountains that had become his companions in retirement. The phone call from General Patterson had been unexpected. The offer of a consultant position with the Armor School even more so. McKinnon had lived a quiet life since leaving the service, occasionally helping local veterans with their cars or trucks, tending to his small garden, watching the world change from a comfortable distance. Now the world was pulling him back in, asking for his expertise, his experience, the knowledge he had accumulated over decades of listening to engines and understanding their secret language. His doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. When he opened the front door, he was surprised to find Master Sergeant Davis standing there, looking slightly uncomfortable in civilian clothes. Master Sergeant, McKinnon greeted him. This is unexpected. Just Robert in this context, if you don't mind, Davis replied with a small smile. I'm not on duty at the moment. McKinnon nodded and gestured him inside. Coffee, please. As McKinnon busied himself in the kitchen, Davis looked around the modest living room. It was neat but not Spartan, the walls decorated with a few photos and mementos from a long military career. A bookshelf held volumes on engineering, military history, and classic literature, a glimpse into the mind of a man who never stopped learning. Davis paused at a small wooden shelf that held a collection of model tanks, each one meticulously detailed and painted. They weren't store-bought collectibles, but handcrafted pieces built with the same care and attention that McKinnon brought to his mechanical work. An M1 Abrams occupied the central position, its miniature barrel marked with 7 tiny hash marks. So, McKinnon said as he returned with 2 cups of coffee, how's your new student doing? Davis accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. Better than I expected, to be honest. The boy's not stupid, just miseducated. That's what I told him, McKinnon agreed, settling into an armchair across from his visitor. It's not entirely his fault. The Army's changed its training philosophy. More computers, less hands-on experience. That's part of why I'm here, Davis admitted. The general is serious about this McKinnon method training program. He wants to formalize what you know, make it part of the curriculum for all technical officers and NCOs. McKinnon sipped his coffee thoughtfully. There's a certain irony in trying to systematize what is essentially an intuitive approach. We're aware of that, Davis said with a chuckle. But we need to start somewhere. The pendulum has swung too far toward technical dependence. We need to bring it back toward the center. They discussed the potential framework for such a program, with Davis taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. McKinnon found himself warming to the idea, despite his initial reservations. There was something appealing about passing on his knowledge, about ensuring that the insights he had gained through hard experience wouldn't be lost to the next generation. There's one more thing, Davis said as their conversation wound down. General Patterson asked me to give you this. Wait. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, placing it on the coffee table between them. McKinnon looked at it warily. What's this, something long overdue? Davis replied simply. McKinnon opened the box to find a silver star, one of the nation's highest decorations for valor. Accompanying it was a formal citation describing his actions at the Battle of 73 Easting. I told them I didn't want this, McKinnon said quietly, closing the box. I know. The general knows too. But he felt it was important not for you, but for the record, for history. Some acts of courage need to be acknowledged, even if the hero is reluctant. McKinnon was silent for a long moment, his weathered fingers resting lightly on the closed box. Finally, he nodded once. I'll accept it, not for myself, but for the men who were there that day, for the ones who didn't come home. That's all the general asks, Davis said, a note of respect in his voice. There's going to be a ceremony next week. The Secretary of the Army will be there. Several members of Congress, too. McKinnon frowned. That seems excessive for a 30-year-old battlefield commendation. This is bigger than just the medal, Frank. Patterson is using it as an opportunity to announce a major overhaul of technical training across all combat branches. Your story, your methods, they've struck a chord with people who've been concerned about the direction of our training for years. After Davis left, McKinnon returned to his porch, the box containing the silver star placed on the table beside his now cold coffee. He pulled out his old Zippo, flicking it open and closed in that familiar rhythm that had become almost meditative over the years. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound transported him across time and space back to that desperate moment in the Iraqi desert, to the fear and determination that had driven him to fix the impossible under enemy fire. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just been doing his job using the skills he had honed over a lifetime of listening to machines. His phone rang, pulling him back to the present. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. McKinnon, he answered. Mr. McKinnon, this is Lieutenant Westbrook. McKinnon raised an eyebrow in surprise. Lieutenant, what can I do for you? There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line. Sir, I was wondering if you would be willing to meet with me. Outside of the official training, I mean. There are things I'd like to learn that might not be in Master Sergeant Davis's curriculum. The request was unexpected but not unwelcome. I suppose that could be arranged. When did you have in mind? This weekend, if you're available, sir. I know it's short notice. Saturday morning, McKinnon decided. There's a diner called Rosie's about 2 miles east of the main gate. 0800 hours. Thank you, sir. I'll be there. As McKinnon ended the call, he found himself intrigued by this development. Westbrook had struck him as arrogant and dismissive, but perhaps there was more depth to the young officer than he had initially perceived. The willingness to seek out additional knowledge to go beyond the official requirements suggested a level of commitment that was commendable. The days passed quickly, filled with preparations for the consultant position and conversations with General Patterson about the scope of the new training program. Before McKinnon knew it, Saturday morning had arrived, bringing with it a crisp Colorado chill that hinted at the approaching autumn. Rosie's Diner was a local institution, a chrome and neon throwback to the 1950s that served the best breakfast in Colorado Springs. McKinnon arrived early, securing a booth by the window where he could watch the parking lot. At precisely 8 o'clock, he saw Westbrook pull in, driving a sensible sedan that seemed to match his methodical personality. The lieutenant entered the diner, scanning the room until he spotted McKinnon. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt, but his military bearing was unmistakable as he approached the booth. Mr. McKinnon, he greeted, extending his hand. Thank you for meeting me. McKinnon shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that hadn't been there a few days ago. Have a seat, Lieutenant. The pancakes here are worth the trip alone. They ordered breakfast, making small talk about the weather and the upcoming decisive strike exercise until their food arrived. Only when the waitress had left them alone did Westbrook broach the real reason for their meeting. Sir, I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the depot, about machines having a language, about needing to listen to them. McKinnon nodded, cutting into his pancakes. And Ibrahim, I think I'm starting to understand, but there's so much I don't know. Master Sergeant Davis is an excellent instructor, but Westbrook hesitated. But he's teaching you the what and the how, not the why, McKinnon finished for him. Exactly. Westbrook looked relieved that McKinnon understood. I can follow the procedures, learn the techniques, but there's something deeper that I'm missing. McKinnon studied the young officer, seeing beyond the embarrassment and determination to the genuine curiosity beneath. This wasn't just about salvaging his career or impressing his superiors. Westbrook truly wanted to understand. Let me ask you something, Lieutenant. Why did you join the armor branch? Why tanks? The question seemed to catch Westbrook off guard. I was good at engineering. My scores were high. It seemed like a natural fit. That's not what I asked, McKinnon said gently. Why tanks? What drew you to these machines specifically? Westbrook considered the question more carefully this time. My grandfather was a tanker in World War II. He never talked much about it, but he had models of Sherman's in his study. As a kid, I was fascinated by them. The power, the complexity, the way all these systems work together. McKinnon nodded, satisfied with this answer. That's where it starts. The fascination, the connection. Machines aren't just collections of parts and systems. They have personalities, quirks, unique characteristics, just like people. But how do you learn to recognize those characteristics, to speak their language? Time, experience, attention. McKinnon took a sip of his coffee. And something else, something that can't really be taught, a kind of empathy for the machine, an ability to put yourself in its place to feel what it's feeling. Westbrook frowned slightly. That sounds almost mystical. It does, doesn't it? McKinnon chuckled. But it's not. It's deeply practical. It's about developing a relationship with the machine, understanding its normal state so intimately that any deviation, no matter how slight, becomes obvious to you. Like a doctor with a long-time patient, Westbrook suggested. Exactly. A good doctor doesn't just run tests. They look at the patient's face, listen to their voice, observe their movements. The tests confirm what the doctor already suspects based on those observations. So Davis has me feeling hydraulic lines, listening to engine sounds, smelling different fluids. Is that enough? McKinnon considered the question. It's a start, but there's more to it than just the physical senses. There's a kind of intuition that develops over time. It's hard to explain. Try me, Westbrook pressed. McKinnon looked out the window for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Have you ever been in a relationship, Lieutenant, a serious one? The question seemed to surprise Westbrook. Yes, sir. I was engaged once during graduate school. And I'm guessing you could tell when something was wrong, even if she didn't say anything. Usually, Westbrook admitted, how Bushham. Small things, the way she'd hold herself, the tone of her voice, the rhythm of her movements. Exactly, McKinnon said. Now imagine it developing that same sensitivity to a machine. The subtle changes in vibration, the slight shift in an engine note, the way the hydraulics respond just a fraction of a second slower than usual. Westbrook's eyes widened as understanding dawned. It's not mystical at all. It's just familiarity, intimate knowledge. Now you're getting it, McKinnon said with a nod of approval. They spent the next 2 hours in deep conversation with McKinnon, sharing insights and experiences from his decades of working with armored vehicles. He told stories of seemingly impossible diagnoses, of problems solved through intuition, when all technical approaches had failed, of the subtle ways in which machines communicate their distress to those willing to listen. Westbrook absorbed it all, asking thoughtful questions and taking occasional notes in a small notebook he had brought with him. The arrogance that had defined their first meeting was gone, replaced by a genuine humility and eagerness to learn. There was a tank commander I knew in Germany back in the 80s, McKinnon recalled. Staff Sergeant Thompson had an almost supernatural connection with his M1. One day during exercises, he ordered his driver to stop and demanded a full inspection of the left track assembly. Nothing wrong according to the instruments, no visible problems. But Thompson insisted. Sure enough, they found a hairline crack in one of the support rollers. Would have failed catastrophically within the hour, probably at full speed over rough terrain. How did he know? Westbrook asked. He said the tank felt different, said it was talking to him. The other officers laughed it off as superstition, but Thompson never lost a tank in all his years of service. And how did you develop this connection? McKinnon thought about it. It wasn't a single moment, more like 1,000 small experiences, each one teaching me something new. Failures as much as successes. Maybe more so. As they finished their third cup of coffee, McKinnon checked his watch. I should be going. I've got a meeting with General Patterson this afternoon about the training program. Westbrook nodded, reaching for the check. Thank you for this, sir. It's been incredibly valuable. McKinnon waved away his attempt to pay. My invitation, my treat. He fixed the lieutenant with a steady gaze. You've got potential, Westbrook. More than you know. Don't let one bad day define your career. I won't, sir. Westbrook hesitated, then asked, would it be possible to do this again? There's so much more I'd like to learn from you. We'll see, McKinnon replied, though his tone was not discouraging. Let's see how you progress with Davis first. As they walked to the parking lot together, McKinnon found himself reflecting on the nature of knowledge transfer, on the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. It wasn't a linear process, not something that could be encoded in manuals or databases. It was organic, relational, built on shared experience and mutual respect. Perhaps that was what the Army's training program had been missing. In its rush to embrace technology and standardization, it had neglected the human element, the mentorship that turned information into wisdom, data into understanding. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The decisive strike exercise went off without a hitch, the repaired Abrams performing flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. Colonel Harrington's brigade received commendations for their readiness and performance, cementing his position and prospects for further advancement. McKinnon, true to his word, accepted the consultant position with the Armor School. He found himself traveling between Fort Benning and Fort Carson, working with instructors to develop a curriculum that balanced technical knowledge with practical experience, data analysis with sensory diagnosis. In one particularly memorable training session at Fort Benning, McKinnon had gathered a group of instructors around the engine compartment of an Abrams. What we need to teach isn't just the specifications and troubleshooting protocols, he explained. We need to teach awareness presence, the ability to listen not just with your ears, but with your entire being. One of the younger instructors, a captain with multiple combat tours but limited mechanical experience, looked skeptical. With respect, Sergeant McKinnon, that sounds great in theory, but how do you evaluate something so subjective? How do you test it? McKinnon smiled. A fair question, Captain. Let's try something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his Zippo. I'm going to make a slight adjustment to this engine. Nothing that would show up on diagnostics, but something that would matter in combat. I want you all to listen to it run, then listen again after I'm done. Tell me if you hear a difference. The instructors gathered around as McKinnon started the turbine engine. Its powerful roar filled the maintenance bay, a sound they had all heard thousands of times. McKinnon let it run for a full minute, then shut it down. He spent a few moments in the engine compartment, then closed it up and restarted the engine. The differences were subtle, a slightly uneven cadence, a barely perceptible fluctuation in the pitch of the whine. Most of the instructors shook their heads, unable to detect any change. But a grizzled master sergeant at the back narrowed his eyes. Fuel flow restriction, he said confidently. Right injector bank. McKinnon nodded approvingly. Exactly right. I partially closed a fuel valve. Minimal effect at idle, but under load, it would create a power imbalance. Might cost you a second or two in acceleration, and in combat, that could mean the difference between life and death. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This wasn't mysticism or mechanics folklore. It was a practical, life-saving skill that couldn't be reduced to a checklist or a computer algorithm. The McKinnon method became a formal part of the training for all armored vehicle maintenance personnel, from junior enlisted mechanics to senior engineering officers. At its core was a simple philosophy. Listen to the machine, respect its language, understand its soul. Lieutenant Westbrook continued his retraining under Master Sergeant Davis, but he also maintained regular contact with McKinnon, meeting him for breakfast at Rosie's whenever their schedules aligned. Each session was a masterclass in mechanical intuition, in the art of diagnosis through observation and touch and sound. Westbrook's transformation was remarkable to those who had known him before. The arrogant MIT graduate who had dismissed McKinnon as an obsolete relic had become a humble student of the old ways, while still maintaining the technical expertise that had made him valuable to the Army in the first place. He wasn't rejecting technology, he was integrating it with something deeper, more fundamental. The computer is a tool, not a replacement for your judgment, McKinnon had told him during one of their sessions. Use it to confirm what your senses and intuition are telling you, not as a substitute for them. Westbrook had taken this lesson to heart. In a maintenance exercise 3 months into his retraining, he had diagnosed a complex electrical problem that had stumped both the diagnostic software and several experienced mechanics. He had done it by listening to the subtle patterns of clicks from the relay box, feeling the minute vibrations in the circuit panel, and correlating these observations with the schematic in his mind. Davis had been watching from a distance, a rare smile of approval on his face. "You're getting it," he said afterward. You're starting to see with your hands and hear with your bones. It was the highest praise Westbrook had received since his ordeal began, and it meant more to him than any academic honor ever had. The days leading to the Silver Star ceremony passed in a blur of preparation. McKinnon found himself thrust into a role he'd never anticipated, not just a recipient of long overdue recognition, but the face of a fundamental shift in military training philosophy. Headlines in Army Times read, "The Ghost of 73 Easting, How One Man's Hands-On Approach is Reshaping Technical Training." Pentagon Briefing cited his methods. His simple philosophy, listen to the machine, had somehow sparked a revolution. The night before the ceremony, McKinnon sat alone in his hotel room, staring at the Silver Star in its presentation case. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones whose names were etched on memorials and whispered in prayers. He had just been a mechanic doing his job using the skills he had honed through years of patient observation and hands-on experience. But perhaps he reflected that was the point. Perhaps the recognition wasn't for heroism in the traditional sense, but for something equally important: the quiet dedication to mastery, the stubborn insistence on understanding rather than merely knowing. In a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and automation, perhaps that was a kind of heroism too. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Colonel Harrington. "Frank," the colonel said without preamble, "there's someone here who'd like to speak with you." Before McKinnon could ask who, another voice came on the line. "Sergeant McKinnon, this is Captain James Miller. I was your tank commander at 73 Easting." McKinnon's breath caught in his throat. "Captain Miller, it's been a long time." "Almost 30 years, Miller agreed. "When I heard about the ceremony, I knew I had to be there. Most of the crew is coming too. Thompson Rodriguez Patel. We've been looking for an excuse to get together, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity." "Yeah, sir, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Frank. Just seeing you again will be enough. What you did that day, well, none of us would be here without you." After the call ended, McKinnon sat for a long time, the Zippo clicking in his hand, memories flooding back. Not just of the battle, but of the men he had served with, the bonds forged in the crucible of combat. They had been more than a crew. They had been a family. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and crisp. McKinnon dressed carefully in the suit General Patterson had insisted on having tailored for him. It felt strange after decades in uniform or work clothes, but he had to admit it fit him well. The ceremony was being held in the grand ballroom of the Broadmoor Hotel, one of Colorado Springs' most elegant venues. As McKinnon entered, he was struck by the size of the gathering. Hundreds of officers in dress uniforms, dignitaries in suits, even a few reporters at the back of the room. It seemed excessive for the recognition of a 30-year-old act of battlefield improvisation. But then he saw them, 6 men standing together near the front of the room. They were older now, hair gray or gone bodies, thickened by time, but he would have known them anywhere. His crew from Ripper 6 together again after all these years. As McKinnon approached, they turned as one, and in their eyes he saw the same recognition, the same bond that had carried them through that desperate day in the Iraqi desert. Captain Miller, now Colonel Miller, stepped forward, first grasping McKinnon's hand in both of his. "Frank, good to see you, old friend." "You too, sir, all of you." McKinnon's voice was gruff with emotion as he greeted each man in turn. Thompson, the gunner who had helped him sight those 7 T-72s. Rodriguez, the loader who had kept the main gun fed despite the chaos around them. Patel, the driver who had maneuvered their wounded beast with uncanny skill through the killing grounds. They had been apart for decades, scattered by time and distance, but in that moment it was as if no time had passed at all. The bonds forged in combat had not weakened or broken. They had merely lain dormant, waiting for this moment of reunion. As the ceremony began, McKinnon found himself seated in the front row with his former crew. General Patterson's speech was eloquent, but mercifully brief, focusing not just on the events of 73 Easting, but on the larger implications of McKinnon's approach to mechanical diagnosis and repair. "In our rush to embrace the latest technology," Patterson said, "we have sometimes forgotten the foundational skills that make that technology effective. The ability to listen, to feel, to understand at an intuitive level the machines we depend on." Frank McKinnon never forgot those skills. And now, through the training program that bears his name, he is ensuring that future generations of soldiers won't forget them either. When it came time for the actual presentation of the Silver Star, McKinnon was surprised to see not the Secretary of the Army step forward, but Captain Miller. By special dispensation, Miller explained with a smile. They're letting me do this. Seemed fitting, all things considered. As Miller pinned the medal to McKinnon's suit jacket, the room erupted in applause. But McKinnon barely heard it. His attention was fixed on the faces of his former crew, on the pride and affection visible in their eyes. This, he realized, was the true recognition. Not the medal, not the speeches, but the respect of the men who had been there, who knew what it had really been like. After the ceremony, as the formal reception began to wind down, McKinnon found himself approached by Lieutenant Westbrook, resplendent in his dress uniform. "Congratulations, sir," Westbrook said, offering a crisp salute. "It's well-deserved." McKinnon returned the salute with a smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant. How are things with Davis?" "Challenging," Westbrook admitted, "but in a good way. I'm learning more than I ever did at MIT. That doesn't surprise me. Davis is one of the best." Westbrook hesitated, then said, "Sir, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Something that's been bothering me since that day at the depot." "Go ahead." "When you first looked at that tank before you even touched it, I think you already knew what was wrong. Not the exact problem, maybe, but the general area." "How?" McKinnon considered the question. "Have you ever walked into a room and known immediately that something was off, even if you couldn't say exactly what?" Westbrook nodded. "It's like that. The tank was holding itself wrong. The way it sat on its suspension, the angle of the turret relative to the hull. Tiny things that most people wouldn't notice, but that told me the problem was in the hydraulic system, not the engine itself. You could see all that at a glance. After 40 years of working with these machines, yeah, it's not magic, Westbrook. It's just familiarity. Deep, intimate familiarity." Westbrook shook his head in amazement. "I'm not sure I'll ever get to that level." "You might not," McKinnon acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean you can't be excellent in your own way. The goal isn't to become me. It's to become the best version of yourself, combining your technical knowledge with the intuitive understanding that can only come from experience." 6 months after their first contentious encounter, McKinnon was completing his latest teaching module at Fort Carson when he received a message asking him to stop by the maintenance depot before leaving. Curious, he made his way there, noticing as he approached that the large bay doors were closed, unusual for the middle of the day. When he pushed open the side door, he was greeted by darkness. Then the lights blazed on, and a chorus of voices shouted, "Surprise!" The entire depot was filled with soldiers, mechanics, engineers, tank crews, all standing at attention. At the front stood Lieutenant Westbrook, now noticeably changed from their first meeting. His uniform was the same, his posture still military precise, but there was a different quality to his presence now, a groundedness that hadn't been there before. "Sergeant McKinnon," Westbrook called out, using his old rank with deliberate respect. "Front and center, if you please." Bemused McKinnon made his way through the assembled troops. As he approached, he saw General Patterson and Colonel Harrington standing to one side, both wearing formal dress uniforms. Master Sergeant Davis was there too, his face bearing its rare full smile. "What's all this?" McKinnon asked as he reached Westbrook. "A graduation ceremony of sorts," the lieutenant replied. "And a thank you." He gestured to a cloth-covered object beside him. With a flourish, he pulled away the cloth to reveal a gleaming torque wrench mounted on a polished wooden plaque. Inscribed on a brass plate were the words, "To Master Sergeant Frank Ghost McKinnon, whose hands built the bridge between knowledge and wisdom, from the grateful tankers of Fort Carson Semper Paratus ad agendum." "Always ready to act." McKinnon translated the Latin motto softly. "The Silver Star was for what you did 30 years ago," Westbrook said. "This is for what you've done for us now, for what you've taught us, what you've shown us." McKinnon ran his fingers over the wrench, feeling the perfect balance of the tool, the smooth action of its mechanism. In many ways, it meant more to him than the Silver Star. This wasn't about valor in combat. It was about the quieter, more enduring value of passing on knowledge, of ensuring that the wisdom of experience wasn't lost to the relentless march of technology. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't need to say anything," Westbrook assured him. "But if you would, we'd be honored if you would inspect our work." He gestured to the far end of the depot where an M1 Abrams sat, its engine compartment open and accessible. "What am I looking for?" McKinnon asked as they walked toward it. "We modified it." Westbrook explained, a hint of pride in his voice. using some of your techniques from Desert Storm but updated for the current systems. We think it improves the hydraulic response time by 20% and reduces the vulnerability to the kind of baffle failure you diagnosed. McKinnon knelt by the open compartment examining the modifications with an expert eye. The work was impeccable, the engineering sound. But more importantly, it showed a true understanding of the machine's needs of the way it would respond under stress. This wasn't just a technical improvement. It was a thoughtful enhancement that respected the tank's essential nature. "This is excellent work," he said, finally looking up at Westbrook and the team of engineers who had gathered around. "You've not only understood the principles, you've improved upon them." The pride in their faces was palpable, a reflection of the genuine achievement they had accomplished. These weren't just technicians applying formulas and following manuals. They were true engineers combining technical knowledge with practical wisdom to create something better than what had come before. As the formal part of the gathering gave way to a more relaxed celebration with cake and coffee being served at the back of the depot, McKinnon found himself standing with General Patterson near the modified Abrams. "They did good work," the general observed. "They did," McKinnon agreed. "Westbrook especially. He's come a long way. Thanks to you, you gave him something his MIT education couldn't perspective. Balance, a respect for experience that complements his technical expertise." McKinnon shrugged modestly. He was ready to learn. "All I did was point the way." Patterson smiled. "That's what the best teachers do. They don't fill their students with information. They ignite their curiosity and guide their exploration." As the celebration continued around them, the general's expression became more serious. "Frank, there's something we haven't discussed about the Silver Star ceremony. It's going to be the backdrop for a major announcement from the Pentagon. They're rolling out your training methods across all technical branches, not just armor, but artillery engineers, even the Air Force." McKinnon frowned slightly. "I'm not sure how I feel about being the poster boy for such a broad initiative." Patterson chuckled. "Don't worry, you won't have to do any publicity. This is about the principles, not the person. But Frank, what you've started here, it's important. It's a correction, of course, that's been needed for a long time." As the afternoon waned and the celebration began to wind down, McKinnon found himself seeking a moment of quiet. He slipped outside the depot, standing in the late afternoon sun, watching the distant mountains that had been his silent companions for so many years. He pulled out his Zippo, that faithful companion that had seen him through the darkest moments of his life. Click-clack, click-clack. The familiar sound centered him, connected him to his past, while grounding him in the present. "Sir." He turned to find Lieutenant Westbrook standing a few feet away, looking somewhat uncertain. "Mind if I join you?" Westbrook asked. "Not at all." McKinnon gestured to the spot beside him. They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the play of light on the distant peaks as the sun began its descent. "I never thanked you properly," Westbrook said finally, "for what you taught me. Not just about tanks, but about everything else." "No thanks needed," McKinnon assured him. "Seeing you apply those lessons is thanks enough." Westbrook nodded, then reached into his pocket. "I got something. I hope it's not too presumptuous." He held out a small object. It was a Zippo lighter, brand new, but with the emblem of the armor school engraved on its side. "I thought maybe for your teaching sessions. A visual aid, you know," Westbrook explained, suddenly self-conscious. McKinnon took the lighter, turning it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it. It was a thoughtful gift, a recognition of the role his old Zippo had played in his story and the legend that had grown up around him. "Thank you," he said, simply pocketing the new lighter. "I'll put it to good use." 1 week later at the Silver Star ceremony, McKinnon stood at the podium facing a room filled with officers and officials. But it wasn't the Secretary of the Army or the congressional representatives who held his attention. It was the front row where 6 men in civilian clothes sat, each wearing a simple lapel pin bearing the emblem of 73 Easting. His tank crew from that day, men who had returned home because of his hands and heart. When McKinnon concluded his brief remarks, his gaze moved not just to the front row, but beyond to rows filled with young officers like Westbrook. In their hands were not tablets or smartphones, but notebooks and pencils. Military history is a circle, not a line. Technology advances, weapons evolve, but the core principles remain unchanged. Listen, learn, adapt. From ancient Roman legionaries to modern drone pilots, it is the human heart, not the machine that determines the outcome of battles. As McKinnon left the stage, the applause thundered like artillery. The only thing he carried with him was not his new medal, but the old Zippo that had accompanied him through the Iraqi desert and now would light the way for the next generation. Click-clack. That sound, as always, was the call of beginning, not ending. In the months and years that followed, the McKinnon method became a standard part of training across all technical branches of the military. It wasn't a replacement for technological education, but a complement to it, a recognition that the most sophisticated diagnostic tools were still only as good as the humans interpreting their results. Westbrook went on to become one of the program's most effective instructors, combining his deep technical knowledge with the intuitive understanding he had learned from McKinnon. He often started his classes by having his students close their eyes and listen to a tank engine, simply listen before they ever touched a diagnostic tool or opened a manual. The numbers will tell you what's happening, he would tell them. But your senses, your intuition, they'll tell you why it's happening. And in the field under fire, that's the difference that matters. As for McKinnon, he continued to teach and mentor well into his 80s, a living bridge between the old ways and the new, the ghost of 73. Easting had become not a legend of the past, but a guide for the future, showing generations of soldiers that in a world increasingly dominated by algorithms and artificial intelligence, there was still irreplaceable value in the wisdom that could only be earned through dirt and steel and time. And sometimes when the moment was right and the lesson called for it, he would pull out a Zippo, the old one or the new one, depending on his mood, and demonstrate how the smallest light could illuminate the darkest spaces, how the simplest tools could solve the most complex problems if wielded by hands that had learned to listen to the soul of the machine.